Hello again, and welcome to day 2 of week 28 of the Religious Education Initiative. We're going to move away now from Metropolitan Anthony Bloom and his book Beginning to Pray, and we're going to read something from the literature of the church. This is sometimes published with texts of the Apostolic Fathers or early church fathers, but what it is a text that comes from either the end or even maybe the late middle of the 1st century, so while the apostles were still alive, or possibly the beginning of the 2nd century. It's called the Didache, ton dodekon apostolon, the teaching of the 12 apostles. And what it is basically a summarized catechesis, a teaching of what the Christian life looks like for those who are preparing to become Christians, who are getting ready to be baptized. Now, in the early church, those who were preparing to be baptized spent a period of time before their baptism fasting and receiving instruction in the Christian faith. And then they were often baptized on the eve of Pascha, so they were doing this preparation for several weeks before Pascha, before Easter. This time of preparation is actually the origin of Great Lent, of the fasting that we do for the 40 days before Easter. So it makes sense for us to read the Didache, this preparation, this catechesis, instruction on what the Christian life looks like over the course of the Lenten fast. So we'll be reading this for the next few weeks. So here's what we have. The teaching of the Lord to the Gentiles, to the nations, by the 12 apostles. There are 2 ways, one of life and one of death, and there is a great difference between these 2 ways. Now this is the way of life. First, you shall love God who made you. Second, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But whatever you do not wish to happen to you, do not do to another. Now the teaching of these words is this: bless those who curse you, and pray for your enemies, and fast for those who persecute you. For what credit is it to you if you love those who love you? Do not even the Gentiles, the nations, do the same? But you must love those who hate you, and you will not have an enemy. It means you are not to have an enemy. Right? Abstain from fleshly and bodily cravings. If someone gives you a blow on your right cheek, turn to him the other as well, and you will be perfect. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. If someone takes your cloak, give him your tunic also. If someone takes from you what belongs to you, do not demand it back, for you cannot do so. Give to everyone who asks you, and do not demand it back, for the Father wants something from his own gifts to be given to everyone. Blessed is the one who gives according to the command, for such a person is innocent. Woe to the one who receives. If, on the one hand, someone who is in need receives, this person is innocent. But the one who does not have need will have to explain why and for what purpose he received, and upon being imprisoned will be interrogated, will be questioned about what he has done, and will not be released from there until he has repaid every last cent. But it has also been said concerning this, let your gift sweat in your hands until you know to whom to give it. So, if you remember much at all from the New Testament, from the Gospels, you'll recognize that pretty much everything in here is something that Jesus says in the course of his ministry, in the course of his teaching. But it's all sort of put together. And what it shows, I want to unpack this a little bit. It says the way of life is love God who made you and love your neighbor. And it doesn't actually say anything else about how to love God, which means that basically we need to read this as we need to understand from this that the explanation of how to love our neighbor is the explanation of how to love God. This is consistent with what Jesus says elsewhere in the gospel reading that we just read last Sunday, on the Sunday of the Last Judgment. when he says, I was hungry and you gave me food, I was thirsty and you gave me drink, and they say, when did we see you hungry and give you food, and thirsty and give you drink? And he says, when you did it to the least of these brothers of mine, you did it to me. So this brings us to the other point that we need to make. If the way that we love God in an active and disciplined way is by loving our fellow man, loving our neighbor, then we have to notice too that most of this talks about loving and being merciful and praying, being merciful to and praying for not just the people that we like, but specifically the people that we don't, our enemies, those that are unpleasant to be around, those who are in need, those even that we think might not deserve it. And this other portion where he says you must give, and I'll read this again because it's, I think, important. He says, or they say, give to everyone who asks and don't demand it back, because the Father wants something from his own gifts to be given to everyone. The point is, if you own something, if you have any possession, that doesn't belong to you. That's God's gift to you. And he wants you, he wants us, to share his gifts with those who come to us. So if someone comes to us and asks for help, at least according to the Didache, we need to give. Maybe not everything, but we need to give something. And then he goes further and he says, now, your job as one who has is to give, is to help, is to serve. But there is a judgment. He says, woe to the one who receives. And then he kind of says, if they actually have a need, they're innocent. No woe. But they need to be careful. They need to be wary before they receive this help. Because if they don't have a need and they receive the gift of God from you undeservingly, without there being a need, then God will hold them responsible. Then they will be punished. They will be imprisoned until they have paid, is what he says, making the metaphor with a debtor. And then finally he gives another warning, and then he says, now, this is one approach, in one way that we've been taught. Anyone who comes and asks, you give to them. And then he says, but there is also the other side, which is let your gift sweat in your hand until you know for sure who to give it to. So he says we need to also have discernment in our helping those who are in need. And the image, I always like this image of the money sweating in your hand, because the idea is you're holding it so long that, you start to sweat around it and it gets wet, which is what happens if you hold money for a long time. Right now, okay, I have a coin in my hand. It's dry, but if I were to hold it for a while, then it's going to start to get wet. So it's an image of, don't even show that you have something to give until you're sure of where is the right place to give it. So we are commanded to help. We are commanded to love, regardless of whether someone is deserving or not. That's between them and God, ultimately, if they receive something that they don't deserve. But we're also told to be careful. And I think part of that is that we don't have unlimited resources. We need to do the best that we can with what we have, and make sure we're not adding evil to some situation. So it's complicated and it's difficult, but just because it's complicated and difficult doesn't mean we aren't commanded to take the burden up and to do what the Lord commands. So that's the first thing that the Didache talks about. The teaching of the 12 apostles is you have received love from God. Give that love to those around you, even your enemies. So, as it's the first week of Lent, we may say, may the Lord give us wisdom and discernment and strength to obey his commandments and to love all that we meet. So, have a blessed day. I'll see you all on day 3.